So welcome everyone to RBKC's annual licensing committee meeting. It's being held virtually on Microsoft Teams. And just to remind everyone that it is a public meeting and it will be available online. I'm Councillor Sof McVeigh. I'm the chair of the licensing committee. And just a few housekeeping, please keep on mute unless you're speaking, and cameras off or on, it's up to you. And if I lose connection, I'd like to nominate a substitute chair. So I'm going to nominate Greg Hammond. And could someone please second this?
Second.
Dory.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So I confirm that Councillor Greg Hammond is the substitute chair in case I lose connection. And we should all have the agenda before us, and we will just go through this, and we'll ask the officers to give us the reports first, and then we will all ask questions. And I have no apologies of absence. Anne, who is helping us with this, can you please confirm that?
Yes, confirmed, Chair. No apologies were received.
Fantastic. And just before we go on to the main agenda, I would just like to acknowledge and thank all the officers working this year in what has been an incredibly challenging year for very obvious reasons, and all the work that the licensing team, the governance team, and the enforcement, legal and highways, for all the work they've done that has come, for the work that's come before this committee, has been incredible, because there have been so many changes you've all had to take into account, as well as working and helping with so many distressed businesses and distressed residents that you've been working so closely with and helping. So on behalf of all the committee, thank you all very much, and I'd really like that to be minuted as well. Thank you. So now onto the agenda. We have declarations of interest. I have none, and if any committee members could please raise their hand and say otherwise if they have any declarations. No, so we will take that as a no.
Chair, sorry. I think Councillor Blakeman has just raised her hand.
Oh,
do I have to say that I know Vince Power, who crops up on one of the appeals?
We'll note that. Thank you.
It's not a declaration because you're not making any determination at this committee. So you can mention it, but there's no report in relation to him.
Okay, great, thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Judith.
Do I have to mention that I'm a bar owner, even although it's not relevant to this meeting?
No, Councillor Evans, you don't need to mention that at today's committee.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that, Heidi. So now we'll turn to the items on the agenda. We have the A4, the annual review of transport and highway fees and charges. And I understand that Mr. Paul White, you will be introducing this report.
Chair, sorry, could you just deal with the minutes from the 12th of February?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, the minutes. I've reviewed the minutes. Any committee members want to comment on the minutes? Sorry, my screen's been jumping around. I can agree the minutes on behalf of all the members present.
Well, as we can't remember.
Agreed.
They agreed. I agreed.
Agreed. So I will be virtually signing them, or will you be sending them to me? Or
if you just agree now that they were signed, then we'll do that when we're back in the town hall, get them all signed physically.
Okay, thanks, Anne. So now we will turn to Mr. Paul Wright's report on the transport and highways fees. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. I'm here, as you've just said, I'm here to present the proposals for the 2021-22 transport and highways fees and charges. We've taken a base increase of 2% inflation for all the charges and generally been rounded to the nearest pound. Any major changes have been noted in the comments column within the table, within the index, and and I would like to make you aware that we have not proposed to make the inflationary increase for the chair licences for the 2021-22 financial year. My colleague James McCall, who is on this within this meeting, can explain why. James, you got any comments?
Hello, everybody. Yes. Obviously, with the current COVID situation and the struggle with a lot of businesses are having, we decided it probably wouldn't look that good to be increasing the license fee per chair by £1. So we've held it for a further year. So it's £19 per chair.
Thanks, James. That's pretty much it. I'm happy to take any further questions regarding the paper. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mr. White. I see a few hands up, and Anne, please help me if I missed some of the hands. Julie, was this one of the reports you wanted to ask a question on?
Yes, please. But
yes. Why didn't you kick off?
Shall I? Okay. In terms of, it's actually item 3, if I may, and I don't know who's going to answer this. I suspect it will be another staff. But it's the reference to stopping up orders and to public inquiry. So it's a penultimate bullet point under para 3. And my question is really about the funding of either potential hearings about stopping up orders, or I actually noted the possibility of a public inquiry, but as there's quite a lot of interest in the activities of Kensington and Chelsea, as well as whether there's been discriminatory practices around Carnival and licensing around Carnival, I wondered whether you're ring fencing within the licensing budget fees for either public inquiries for stopping up orders or for any other actions that might be coming our way. So it's really a finance question. So I don't know who should answer that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Julie. James, do you want to answer that, or maybe Heidi will come in on that, or maybe we need to get back to Julie on that? Mute, James.
Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, in relation to stopping up orders, that's a service that I administer. So that's in relation to actually permanently stopping up a piece of highway. So if there's planning permission given for a new building and that encroaches beyond the boundary line of the property and onto the highway, and we lose a sliver of highway, we publicise the making of a stopping up order, and people are allowed comment on that. But that always happens after the planning application process. So a lot of local concerns would have been aired and dealt with during the planning process. So when it comes to the stopping up order process, in my experience since 2008, they have all continued to completion without having to go to an inquiry. So although that is on our schedules of fees and charges, it's never actually been used or invoked. It may be the figure's too low in practice. I'm sure an inquiry will cost more than that. But yes, it's something that's been on our fees and charges for years and just rolls over. In terms of Carnival and things like that, I think that they'd be completely different types of orders. They wouldn't be stopping up orders per se. That, you know, there might be traffic orders or road closure orders. I'm not personally aware that we've gone to any inquiries in relation to those sorts of things. So in relation to the stopping up orders, which was highlighted, all the council is doing is following the terms of the relevant act, which is the Town and Country Planning Act, section 147, I believe, and it says the different steps, and it says, well, if it's contested, it needs to go to an inquiry. So in relation to other functions, you know, I'm not sure why that's not there, but perhaps the statute doesn't allow for inquiries, or there's a different means for resolving them.
Mr. McCool, I've probably expressed myself very badly, for which I do apologise. The question is not around process. The question is around budget. So and it may be, as I say, that the budgetary setting, it may be Ms. Dyball wants to talk to this at some point, and happy to wait for an answer. The question is, where is the money, the contingency fee or the ring fence budget, to allow for public inquiries, whether there be stopping up orders or discriminatory practices around, let's say, licensing or the use of the footway or the pavement. So it's more a finance question. And Chairman, I'm very happy for the answer to come back at another time. I appreciate it may not have been anticipated, and I do apologise for not bringing it to your attention before.
No, that's fine. I just wondered, because it may kind of, Heidi might have some insight into this because of her work on the appeals. I don't know, Heidi, if you want to comment on this, or if we just come back to this.
In relation to the appeals, that's under licensing legislation. So if there are appeals, there's specific references in the magistrates' court that we can seek to recover our costs. That this is different because this is regarding the highway regime. So it would have to be determined on the basis of the cost there. The only thing I would say is that because of Hemmings, you can only guesstimate how much your costs will be for a year. If it turns out that your costs are much higher and you think they're reasonable costs to recover from the whole regime, then you're entitled to recover that in the next year. So you can reduce the costs if you've got a surplus, and you can increase the costs if there's a deficit. Now, whether that would cover a whole inquiry, we wouldn't know until we knew how much the fees are, but there is that facility under Hemmings.
Okay, thank you for that, Heidi. I think we do need to probably have a bit more information and come back to you on this, Julie, if we may. James, it sounds as if it's definitely a highway thing rather than Sharon's department, although she will obviously be overlooking all this. So if you could get back to us, please, on that. Thank you. Moving on to Charles William.
Yes, I just wondered, are we getting many renewals or new applications for tables and chairs under this regime, or is it all going to pavement licenses?
Yes, good question. But shall we come on, because James is going to actually give us the report on pavement licenses.
Right, fair enough.
James, are you going to give us a report separately? Notice that's.
Yeah, but that's for information report. But yeah, I can pick up anything related to tables and chairs then.
Okay, Charles, hold that question. We'll come back to that. Malcolm?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, my question was about pavement licences as well. To give Mr McCool a bit of advance notice, in the table in the appendix, the very last entry, it says the licenses are valid until September 2021. So the question will be, do they all cease then? And if so, is that due to council policy or national legislation? If they don't cease in September 2021, will they carry on for another year? I'm happy to wait for the answer. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, let's wait for that. It is government policy, I believe, but James will answer that. So thank you. Pat, question.
Thank you, Chair. Mine is much more simple than that. In the introduction, it refers to a recommendation from the lead member for finance and modernisation that a minimum increase of 2% for inflation be applied. I'd like to know what the basis of that is, given that inflation is nowhere near 2% at the moment.
Good question. Thank you, Pat. We don't have Councillor Wheel on the line, so who would answer that? James or?
Councillor McVeigh, Santoneto Horbury. All I can say is that these the 2% is given to us by our finance colleagues, so I can take away and find out from them on what basis that was done. But this 2% is also it applies to all fees and charges across the council, not just the licensing fees and charges. So it's not specific to licensing. The 2% applies to all the council fees and charges. But I'll contact our finance colleagues and try and get more information on what basis that was done on.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Just working through this. Dory, question.
Thank you. It's also the last item in the table, pavement license. It says new fee, £100. Proposed charge 2020 next year, 2021 to 2022. What did we charge when it was introduced? which was in July, I think, 20.
Chair, I can answer that. It's Heidi here. Under the pavement licences, there's a limit. You can only charge £100, and that's a statutory limit under the legislation.
Thank you. But did we charge that as soon as we introduced? Because it doesn't. It says current charge, not applicable.
I think Mr. McCall can answer that query as to what he's actually charging for the applications.
Yeah, it's been £100 since they were introduced in the last week of July 2020. I think the reason why it's presented in the report in the way that it is that when we were here a year ago and we're considering fees and charges, obviously pavement licenses didn't exist.
Sure.
So I think it's comparing, this year to a year ago. I think that's why it's written the way it is.
Okay. Perhaps a note that actually from July of the current year there was a fee. Anyway, thank you. Thanks, Mr. McCall.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dory. Greg, a question?
Thanks, Chair. It wasn't really a question. It was just going back to Pat's question on inflation, which I have asked that question before in other contexts on both the council and in a former life in the Ministry of Defence. And the answer I've always had is that the inflation figure set by the Treasury and then cascaded out to all branches of government as an annual basis. So I would strongly suspect that that's the origin of that 2% figure that we're seeing in the documents today. Obviously, we'll need to await for confirmation of that from our finance colleagues and the council, but that would be the answer. I'd expect that it's a centrally set figure.
Thank you for that. That's very helpful. I've got a couple of questions. Most of them relate to pavement licenses, so I'm happy to wait until, James, you've spoken a bit about that. But I have one question for Mr. White about the fixed penalty notice. So the fixed penalty notice is obviously less for quite a few of these things. So what's to stop someone just putting a sack of rubble or something on the pavement and not getting a license and just going, okay, if I get caught, I'll pay the FPN. And then also, excuse me if I haven't understood this, but some of them don't have a period on them. And so does the fee relate to a certain time frame? So for the banners, it's very clear how long the time frame is for them and the costs related to taking them up and removing them. But for a lot of the other things, for example, how long is the memorial bench paced on the highway for? For example, the scaffolding, is it also dependent on the size? Just a little bit more information would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. Right. I can't answer that question off at the moment, but I will contact a couple of colleagues and get back to you.
Very helpful. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
No. Thank you very much for your report. So although the pavement licenses is actually part of the A5 information report, there's so many questions about the fees that are on the A4 report. I think we need to move to you, James, before we can kind of approve this first report, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
it is actually for decision, and there's so many questions about the fees for the pavement licenses. So although I'm slightly jumping around, does that make sense?
Yep, that's okay.
Thank you.
So we introduced a new fee in July the 24th, 2020, I believe. We did so in a hurry because the government enacted the Business and Planning Act 2020. This act was designed expressly to basically assist hospitality businesses to trade on street because, for public health reasons, it was preferable for people to dine outdoors rather than indoors, and it was to support those businesses. So the act was accompanied by government guidance that basically advised authorities how to apply the act, and basically the the message within the guidance is really, you really need to do whatever you can to help these businesses, to help the economy, to help society to get through this. So the council rose the challenge. We prepared our own guidance. We got our own sort of IT systems in place to allow people to apply with ease. We set the fee at £100 under the Act. We did have discretion as to where we set the fee up to a limit of £100. So we could have levied a £10 fee, for example, but we set it at £100 because our costs in dealing with the applications greatly exceed that figure. Authorities throughout the land have basically all applied £100. Very few authorities, or none that I'm actually aware of, have said, "Oh, well, let's go for £10." I think it's £100, across the piece, really, across the land. So we've had over about 200 license applications since then, most of which have been granted, and they have proven to be quite popular. So where tables and chairs are on footways, they are more or less equivalent to our traditional tables and chairs licenses, but from the point of view of the hospitality business, they're a lot more attractive because the application fee is lower and the application process is quicker. So under the Highways Act 1980, there's a statutory process for tables and chairs license applications, and that includes a 4-week consultation period. So overall, the process takes up to 8 weeks, whereas of pavement licenses, by law, the consultation period starts basically on submission. So it starts immediately after the application is made, and it lasts for 7 days exactly. It doesn't matter if there's bank holidays or public holidays or whatever. It's 7 days, it's fixed exactly 1 week. And then we have one further week to determine the application based on, all material considerations, including any responses we received during the consultation period. And if we don't determine within that second week, at the end of that period, it just gets default approval, subject to several national conditions. But yeah, it gets default approval if we don't determine it in time. So because of that, we had to introduce quite a streamlined process. People apply online, and once they apply online, it gets posted to our website that very evening, and the consultation period starts automatically. And it's up to the hospitality businesses to post the site notice on their frontage, and we ask them to take a photograph to email us to prove that they have indeed done this, and most of them have done that. We, because it's by site notice and because it's on a web page that perhaps not everybody knows about, the consultation isn't as full, you might say, as under the Highways Act, where we write to adjacent premises and things like that. We don't do that here. Nonetheless, some of them have been picked up by locals, and we have received objections to several of the applications. And they have resulted in what we're calling here contested pavement license applications. So we have been applying the Constitution, the Council's Constitution as is, and in situations where there have been 3 or more objections from members of the public, or a single objection from a ward councillor, we have been asking the chair for determination. So under normal circumstances with the tables and chairs license application, because there's no statutory deadline for determination, what we do is we bring them to licensing subcommittee B, and the usual things are considered, and members make a determination. Obviously those committees are monthly or even less frequently, and there's times to prepare the report and distribute agendas and all of that. So it's actually not suitable at all for determining pavement license applications. So under the Constitution, if there's no licensing committee scheduled, it is the chair that was to determine the pavement license applications.
And the vice chair. And the vice chair.
Well, the vice chair, if the chair is not available, as far as I'm aware. So there have been a number of occasions where Councillor McVeigh was not available, and Dory Schmetterling acted as vice chair. So, as you know, in that capacity, he was de facto chair for the purposes of decision making. I think in those ones. So, we had 7 of them up until I think it was October last year, 2020, when we changed the constitution slightly. So the constitution meant that we could only get determination from members, and because everything moved so quickly with pavement licenses, there was a risk. I mean, it was a risk that was never realised, but there was a theoretical risk that we couldn't get hold of members and that the council wouldn't be able to determine a particular licence application, and then it would just get automatic permission. So we changed the constitution slightly to allow the Director of Streets and Regulatory Services to determine these applications in consultation with members, in consultation with the chair of the licensing committee. So the practice then is more or less the same as before. It's just that in the event that the members couldn't be contacted or weren't available or couldn't give a steer, the council would still be able to determine the application. So that change happened in October, and we've had 3 contested license applications since then. And in practice, we have continued as before. We've referred the matter to members. Members have given their view, and then the Director of Streets and Regulatory Services has determined the application in accordance with members' direction.
Can I just interrupt here and just to remind the committee that change happened in October, did come before full council and was agreed, and there was, officers can't just completely agree it if it is contested. It has to come either before the chair or the vice chair or someone standing in that role. And just to clarify, James, that for the licensing committee, as we all know, we never sit on anything in our ward. I'd also like to suggest, and I try to practice this, that I never determine any pavement licenses in my ward. So I don't know if this is the right format to put this into place, or is that has to be under a different format?
I think the Heidi will have the right terminology for this, but I think the standing orders already provide for that. So we've had a few instances this year where there have been pavement licence applications in Brompton ward, and in those cases you had nominated Councillor Dory Schmetterling to act up and determine those, and that has happened. So I'm not sure any change is required in a governance sense. I think that's already in place.
Okay, I think I'd probably just do that on a personal kind of level. I don't think there's anything written, and I don't know whether as a committee, I don't know what other committee members, I'm not going to be chair forever, want to comment on that.
Chair, did you want me to come in? It's
Yes,
Heidi.
please. Thank you, Heidi.
Yes, so in terms of licensing, we have a statement of licensing policy, and in that policy, members, which obviously, as you know, it's considered by licensing committee, but it's approved by full council. And years ago, members always decided that they thought it would be better if ward councillors did not determine applications in their own ward. So that's why it's a matter of policy for the Licensing Act applications.
Yeah, I understand that. Yes,
it's not a matter of policy for any other licensing application that I'm aware of. But as you say, in practice, that's what you do. So the Constitution doesn't require it, but it's good practice, so members can deal with it in that manner.
Okay, so again, my question is still, should we be making this slightly more formal without making it part of the statement of licensing policy? I see many hands up. if it's on this thing, Malcolm, do you want to say something?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. What worries me is the other way round. We've had examples, as Mr. McCool knows, where the ward councillors and the lead member have visited various premises, restaurants, pubs, encouraged them to apply for pavement licenses, and in our view, they were good candidates to do so, only to find later they were refused by officers acting alone. So I just wonder, is there a protocol for that? And nowhere in these papers can I see the numbers who were refused. In the table, it says 180 were applied for, but in paragraph 1.6 on page 2, it says 180, but in the table, it says 250. So I'm not clear how many licenses were actually applied for. And then secondly, how many were refused? And then thirdly, do we have a protocol where councillors want something to be granted and officers refuse?
Okay, good question. I'm just going to hold those questions. James, can you please come back in a moment to Malcolm? I just want to bring Dory in here to see what you want to say, Dory.
Thanks, Chair. I've got actually 2 points, but only one of them. One relates to this particular question, so I'll just stick to that. I agree that we should try not to shouldn't sit on our own ward cases. And I mean, I'm aware of a tables and chairs or a pavement license case in my ward, and I had representations anyway from the residents about it. So I agree. I support that idea. I would say in the planning side, as I'm sure Ms. Titcombe well knows, that it is. I mean, I know,
Dory. We know the planning. The planning is a different committee. Yeah.
Yes, I personally also declined to sit on a case where, even though I could, I declined for the same reason. Yeah. It could be a clash of interest, conflict of interest. That's why I raised the planning matter. It's simply that. Yeah,
they're very sensible. And Greg, can I bring you in here as well?
Yeah, just on the same point, I think planning get themselves tied in all sorts of knots, sitting on cases in their own ward and conflicts of interest. I think we've got the best practice right, and even if it's not technically absolutely required as a matter of policy on tables and chairs, or indeed the pavement licenses, it probably should be, and the best practice is the one that you're applying, and I completely support it.
Thank you for that. That's great. So James, can we just loop back to you about answering those questions, particularly Malcolm's ones? Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, just to clear up the discrepancy. So I think in the body of the report, the 1.6, the 180 pavement license applications, I think that probably relates to distinct addresses, and it excludes the ones that were made subsequently invalid. Whereas the larger figure is derived from our systems, and they're the number of times the form was actually filled out and the application fee submitted. So that was 256, I think. So, but what I can do is I can, subsequent to the committee, I can prepare a fuller note, basically what happened to all of these in terms of how many were approved, how many were refused, how many had to apply a second time because they weren't made valid the first time. In terms of how we assess these things as officers, and also, you know, as members, once they're contested, and it's for members to decide. I mean, we look at guidance, the guidance that we approved back in the summer, and we updated again in October. And that basically says we are going to grant these things so long as, they aren't going to unduly impact on amenity. But we're positively disposed to these applications in all cases. On occasion, some people just come in with something that would actually be harmful if it was implemented. And in those cases, we have to refuse. What we do is we positively engage with the businesses and tell them what would be appropriate and what we could approve. Sometimes people don't fill out the form properly, and the act under which we're acting basically sets out what an application should include. So the application does need to be completed fully. If it's not completed fully, well, then we can't actually issue a license under the law. So some applications are rejected simply because the applications aren't complete. But in those cases, what we do is we contact the applicants, we tell them where they went wrong, and we give them a free go, in effect. So we do. And how the free go works, under our system, we have to take, basically, they can't submit the application unless they pay the £100. It's all automated. But what we do is we then give them a refund. So we give them a refund at a later date, usually within a week or two. So that's also one of the reasons why there's a discrepancy between these two figures, between the body of the report and the appendix.
Thank you, James. I think that would be very helpful if you could send around a note about the guidance and about the safety issues.
Chair, can I just come in? It's Heidi here. Just on the legal issue, we have to be careful that the application, as James has said, has to be determined based on the criteria set in the Act. So whilst everyone fully understands that the council wants to support the hospitality industry, the council can't predetermine what it will do. It has to determine the application in an open and fair way. Otherwise, it's subject to challenge, as any decision is. So even if members are saying, yes, please go along and make an application, as James said, and I've certainly seen it over the year, because obviously this is a very fast process, that applicants were learning and everybody else. So if they haven't completed their form correctly, or they haven't submitted enough information, then they do have to process it fairly. But as James says, they do try and help applicants to indicate what information they can add.
Yeah.
But they do have to determine properly.
Thank you, Heidi. Yes, I agree. But just a guidance to the committee, incorporating what the Act says, and also how the officers also kind of pull it all together would be really helpful. Thank you. Julie, your hand's up.
Thank you. Just to be absolutely clear, probably a question for Heidi. Although it's best practice for councillors not to sit on applications within their own ward, it's not law. Is that right, Heidi?
Yes, it isn't law, and there's not a paper before you today. You as a committee can determine your own procedure for all these types of applications. But as
that's fine. Just really was a clarification for the committee and the public. And the second reason to say that that's in law is simply because there may be a time when you have loads of applications, and administrative pressures may mean that ward councillors do have to sit on matters in their own ward, and what determines how they listen to that is the open and fair process and transparency that Heidi has just alluded to. Which brings me on to my second question. I was rather troubled by what Councillor Spalding has just said, that ward councillors sitting on licensing committees that may therefore find themselves in a position to predetermine the application, even though they should therefore recuse themselves, and lead members of visiting premises and recommending that they should go to committee. I want to suggest that a lead member should never be doing that, in my view, if it's to be transparency and not lead to the wrong conclusions being drawn and subject us then to appeals. And ward councillors who are on the licensing committee, who may find themselves not able to recuse or sit on an application, should not be recommending to premises that they get a license. They should be, in my view, simply recommending them to the officers to advise them on whether they might be successful or should apply. So I'd like some clarification around that, please, in terms of transparency and process.
I'm just going to jump in here, Julie, because I have discussed this. We're getting a bit confused of whether we're talking about the licensing, the premises license holders, where it is in our statement of licensing policy, which is of course not the law, but it is our statement of licensing policy, where no ward members sit on anything in their ward. And so far, we've never had an issue with finding. We've always managed to find a quorum for the committee. So that I think we're all in agreement with, doesn't need any changing. And as we know, as ward councillors, we often do get very involved with local residents and local businesses, either for or against certain of those decisions. So I think that's clear. The thing we're talking about today is the pavement licenses, and whether, as Greg said, we introduce, which we are doing now, best practice. Because again, as ward councillors, as you know, when you're walking down Holland Avenue and you know the pros and cons of various places, and so therefore you probably wouldn't sit on a tables and chairs committee about that. And so I think we're in agreement about that. But I don't think you can say ward councillors should never get involved in any of their ward issues. I think it's much easier to recuse yourself from a committee.
Well, yes, I think we're going to be splitting hairs here, and I don't want to prolong this discussion. It's not necessary. But I mean, I think that appeals are based not on statement of policies, but on law. And it's very, very important that a licensing committee, and indeed a planning committee, which is quasi-judicial, albeit that's not really correct, but that is how we self-style ourselves, is about understands, and its members understand the law and don't swing it according to what might be a political or
yes.
a ward interest agenda.
Understood.
And I think it's very important that we don't send out wrong messages.
No, of course.
And we have to be governed by open and fair and transparent legal process, and not subject the authority to the potential for appeal and also poor reputation, because
yes.
we have been applying subjective.
Okay, Julie, I think you've made your point. Thank you.
Well,
yes.
no, I was just correcting you, Madam Chairman, because I think your point was a little unclear. So I thank you for agreeing.
Well, I'm not sure I agree with your correction about whether, that's why we all have the declarations of interest at the beginning of every subcommittee. So I'm going to move on. I've got Councillor Charles Williams, your hand's up.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, there's 2 points. Have any of the applications for pavement licenses, the R's approved, been less than the applicant requested? Because I noticed all the cases listed here, they were all 10 o'clock, and I know in many cases we've determined with tables and chairs that the R's are reduced. And I was interested in whether you consider there would be cases where you would not approve the R's that were applied for, or 10 o'clock. And secondly, I'd be interested to know, as I asked earlier, whether there are still applications coming in for tables under the Highways Act.
Thank you, Charles. I'll pass it over to James in a minute. But yes, on some of the contested ones, I definitely reduced some of and the officers, some of the hours down, particularly I think on Sunday nights, and some of them, I think there was a couple reduced to 8 p.m. But I do agree that's an important question. James.
Yeah, so our guidance we prepared in the summer was basically drafted to allow us to process the license applications quickly. Officers have basically been applying the guidance systematically and rigorously, so there's no bias whatsoever. Under the guidance, it said that the terminal hour should be 10 p.m. That is mainly because, from our experience over the years dealing with tables and chairs license applications, most of the problems arise after 10 p.m. But we also wanted to assist businesses through this difficult time. So I think tables and chairs do need to be out until about 10 p.m. for them to get, a decent dinner session. And if things are brought in much earlier, they can't really serve dinner in the evening. And so our application form, online application form, that was online until October, and basically when they were filling out the form, it was basically hardwired, so people couldn't really apply for an hour later than 10 o'clock. Now, they could apply for shorter hours if they wanted to, and we did have a few cafes who, didn't need the evening, so they applied for what they needed for. But in terms of restaurants that are open in the evening, the application form was for 10 p.m. And now, under the Act, people are allowed to apply for whatever they want in terms of hours. So we did have a little caveat on the form saying that, well, if you want to apply for different hours, please contact the Tables and Chairs team, and we can sort that out for you. Now, very few people availed of that facility. Most people just wanted to get the applications in and everything, and they would have read our guidance, and our guidance was quite clear that it said that, in most circumstances, having a terminal hour after 10 p.m. wouldn't be appropriate. So that's why they are mostly 10 p.m. Now, there are a few, as Councillor McVeigh has said, once it got to contested situations and where members were able to have their say, they were able to use their discretion to reduce the hours. And I think that's important, because those were the cases that were contested, and the ones that the locals were most concerned about. But in the uncontested ones, officers just rigorously just applied the guidance. So if somebody applied for anything up to 10 p.m., well, that's what was granted. Does that answer the question?
Are you okay with that?
Yeah, just the question of whether people are still applying under the Highways Act.
They actually were. They certainly, it's taken a long time for people to, even though we have been publicising the availability of pavement licences and everything, a lot of people did renew under the previous Act. So we were getting a steady stream of Tables and Chairs licence applications, I would say, up until Christmas. So over time, the number of applications under the Highways Act has fallen, and we haven't gotten any in the last months. But yes, we got plenty in the second half of 2020. And, as things stand, from the 1st of October 2021, everybody will have to apply again and get a Highways Act, a license under the Highways Act.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, James. I'm just aware we're spending a lot of time on this, but I think it's really important as it is very new. But I think fundamentally, James, one question which is really important to the whole committee is, as you say, it is stopping in the autumn. And when do you have any idea when we'll know if that is going to continue? Because again, as we've got to look as a committee, what will happen beyond the autumn, and will we then just revert back to our standard application fee of £500 and then fee per chair? No, but the plan is, this is the plan. In the next, probably towards the end of March, we'll publish a key decision report that will set out perhaps a new policy on tables and chairs that is different from what we had before the pandemic. Basically, that would set out the steps that would need to be gone through if a hospitality business wanted, say, tables and chairs beyond the curb. So you would have seen there's a number of locations in the borough where we have tables and chairs on suspended parking bays. We're able to do that using pavement licensing, and because we're assuming that those areas are what we're calling footway extensions, and so because we're only allowed to issue pavement licenses, and indeed we're only allowed to issue tables and chairs licenses on the footway. So what we have been doing is we have been demarcating those areas with traffic cones and saying everything within the side of the traffic cones is a footway. But going forward, post September the 30th, we will need a new set of arrangements. With pavement licenses, the beauty of them in terms of for the hospitality businesses is pavement licenses come with planning permission. They come with deemed planning approval. So once you get a pavement license, you have planning approval to place tables and chairs in a given area. Now, once pavement licenses are no longer available, planning permission will be required
to place tables and chairs on parts of the highway that previously didn't have tables and chairs. As you know, the planning process is 8 weeks, but it can take even longer if it's a contested situation. So what we intend to do is we intend to publish guidance later in the spring, and that's going to advise businesses what they need to do. And if any businesses want to have tables and chairs beyond the curb, they will have to apply for planning permission for them, you know, in a timely manner. So we have to develop all of that guidance.
Okay, understood. And as we all know, everything seems to change all the time right now. I'm just going to bring Janet in here because we haven't heard from Janet yet. I think your hand was up. Or has your hand now gone down?
Yes, I just wanted to know if the tables and chairs 10 o'clock will be consistent with their licensing. In other words, let's say a pub is allowed to have people drinking pints outside till 11 o'clock, but their tables and chairs will be 10 o'clock. What is taken into account there?
Well, the tables and chairs, I suppose, they're obstructions on the highway.
Right.
So they're dealt with slightly differently to premises licensing. We, as you know, in this borough, the way we're arranged is the pavement licenses and the tables and chairs licenses are issued under the Directorate of, well, Transport and Highways, or what's now called Streets and Regulatory Services. So although we are in communication with our colleagues in premises licensing, we only consider our particular guidance, and our guidance does have hours hardwired into it that suggests that anything after 10 p.m. would have to be considered very carefully. And in practice, we've only issued in the last year just 1 or 2 after 10 p.m.
Yes, that's quite sensible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Janet. That was important to clarify. I'm aware that we've done one report so far, and we've done an hour. We've got a lot. We've got all the rest of licensing to do. So if there's anything that hasn't been covered, I noticed some hands still up. If James hasn't covered them, Heidi.
Just a matter of constitution, Chair. Report A4 does contain a recommendation. So the members, I don't believe they've actually approved that yet, whereas the pavement licence application, which was A5, was just noting. So members do need to make a decision on A4.
I understand, Heidi. That's why we had to get James in to talk about it before we could, because there were so many questions on pavement licences. So I'm aware we've got to go back and make a decision on that. Definitely. But Dory, your hand's up.
Thanks. I've got wind up with 3 points now. One is just to follow on about the question asked about the renewal, the application under the Highways Act. How many of them were renewals? Because obviously anyone, presumably, so that's the question, anyone who's already got a tables and chairs license under the Highways Act would just renew that rather than change it to a pavement license, would be my question. That would make sense, wouldn't it?
Well, the thing is, the pavement license is less expensive. So, okay. So the average price of a license under the Highways Act is probably about 800 to 900 pounds, whereas a pavement license is 100 pounds. And the process is a lot easier as well. So most people who are fully aware and fully versed of all the information and consider properly, the rational thing to do would probably be to apply for a pavement license.
Oh, because the renewals, I mean, I see the renewals too. I get asked about them, and usually it's, yep, no problems, go. So that seems, anyway, maybe it's the cost issue, except that the pavement, well, okay, it's cost issue. Second question is, so we seem to have a really good, efficient process in, we've set it up, made some changes to the Constitution to run this process of pavement licenses. How are the other London boroughs doing it? Is it similar? Have we learned from them, or they learned from us, Westminster in particular?
I can answer the Westminster one. They do it slightly differently in the sense that that they were limiting the amount of time they were granting pavement licenses. So they were only giving 3 months. for £100, so people then had to reapply, because you can only grant a licence between 3 months and a year, and obviously they Act will cease to have effect from the 30th of September. So Westminster have done it slightly differently.
Thanks. But has anyone also changed the constitution a little bit, adjusted it to really speed it up? As
we had to by law. That was what James McCool was referring to earlier on.
Okay.
Hence, pavement license, £100 pavement license.
No,
very quick.
No, it was about the also the director of the department could.
In Westminster, they didn't need to change the constitution because, of course, they grant tables and chairs licenses not under the Highways Act. They do it under the Westminster Act, so they don't have this requirement for members to determine those sort of applications.
I see. Thanks. My final question is.
Thank you. I just saw among the cases, in fact, that's the one in my ward that attracted submissions, Ola and Stein. They were granted 3 months from the 27th of November, I just see in this pack. But I don't think they've had any tables outside in that time so far. So what happens in such a case? They've got the license, paid the £100 and haven't actually used it. I mean, who would in this weather anyway?
Well, in that case, at that particular date, on that day, we weren't to know that the government were going to change the restrictions, and we had just come out of the second lockdown, and I think things were looking a little bit brighter for a very brief period. So they applied in good faith. We issued the license in good faith. We limited it 3 months because it had been contested, because there was doubts as to whether there was sufficient clear footway width, and we said what we'd do is we'd monitor it for 3 months. But as it happens, unfortunately for them, they won't be able to use their license just because of the situation that we're in. So they will have to apply again, I'm afraid.
All right, that was the underlying question, is in that case, there's no dispensation for an extension for another 3 months test. Because I gathered it. I mean,
they would have to apply again. There's no choice. They have to apply again.
Thank you.
Thank you, James. Sometimes you're more flexible on the fees, though, when that happens, though, aren't you?
Yes, that's right. Yes. If people have been disadvantaged through no fault of their own, what we can do as an authority to help them out is refund the £100 fee. And that may be appropriate in this case.
Yes, that one did definitely spring to mind. Thank you for that. Thank you, everyone, for these questions. I think there's a lot to be going through about this, because it has been such a huge change this last year in nationally and on locally on our streets. So thank you, James, for answering all those questions. But as Heidi says, we do need to we have kind of taken two reports as one. The A4 does require a decision, but the A5 was for information. But I think all that information that James has provided has enabled us to make a decision on A4, which was my plan. So we need to do a decision. So the committee has recommended to approve the proposed increases in the fees charged by the council detailed in this report. This is Mr. Paul White's report, for issuing a variety of licenses and permits with effect from the 1st of April 2021. So I am minded to approve this. Heidi, how do we do a vote virtually?
Thank you, Chair. If you're minded to approve it, you can ask any other members whether they have any objection. They can indicate whether they have any objection. And if they don't, then anyone who's attended will be counted as approving it.
Okay. Members, does that make sense to you all? Any objections to this?
No, I agree.
Agreed.
Agreed. Great.
Agreed.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Heidi, for clarifying that. And thank you, James and Mr. White, for going through those two reports and answering all those questions. And the mechanism for following up, will that just be an email to all the committee about some of those points? James, would that be?
Yes, quite a lot of clarification was required around payment licensing. So yeah, it may take me a week or two to get that information together. But yes, I can send an email to everybody who was invited to this meeting. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you for being so proactive on all these incredible changes that have happened over the year. Thank you. So now we're moving on to A6 report. This is again a report for decision, and this is licensing fees. So is Sharon doing this, proposing this report? Going to speak to this report?
Yes, thank you, Chair. The report before you sets out our proposals and recommendations for the licensing fees and charges for the year commencing the 1st of April 2021. You'll see going through the report that it doesn't include fees which are set by statute, which predominantly is our premises licence fees for the hospitality industry. I think it's fair to say that the past 10 and a half months have had a devastating effect on the majority of our licensed premises. Our special treatment and gambling premises have been under a complete closure for at least 6 and in some cases 7 months since March last year. Many of our special treatment premises are small independent businesses, some of which rent 1 or 2 rooms from a larger business such as a hairdressing salon. And as a result, they have not the registered rate payer, and for some this has meant that they are not eligible for some of the government business support loans and grants. It was agreed with senior management in the spring that to support businesses at this very difficult time, that the application fees for licence renewals for special treatment and our licensed sex shop would be discounted pro rata for each month that they were unable to operate due to the lockdown. As is mentioned within the papers, our special treatment licence renewal periods are staggered throughout the year, and we have 4 renewal dates in April, July, October and January. At the time that the April and July renewal applications were being made, we were still in the first national lockdown, so payment of the application fees was deferred when these made their applications until lockdown was eased and the premises were allowed to reopen. The lockdown, as you're aware, started to ease at the beginning of July, so these premises were asked to pay a pro rata fee of between 7.5 and 8 months, 8.5 months of the full fee, depending on when they were permitted to reopen. Since then, we've had 2 further lockdowns where these businesses were required to close in November, and the latest one, which started on the 20th of December last year. The application fees for the renewals due at the end of October were readjusted to factor in the additional closure during November, and the fees for the most recent renewals due at the end of January have also factored in the latest closure period up until the 19th of February 2021. Our one licensed sex shop, which is renewed at the end of September, has been reduced. The fee for that has been reduced to take account of a 6.5 month closure period. Payment for this application has not yet been received. Our gambling premises do not need to renew their licence each year, but they are subject to an annual fee. With those, invoices are generated automatically via an interface between our licensing database and the council's finance system. At the time that the invoices were generated and sent out, the extent of the closure period was not known, so the invoices for these gambling premises was generated at the full amount. So other than the hospitality industry, which is licensed under the Licensing Act 2003, the special treatment, sex shop and gambling premises are the only other licensed premises which have been required to close for significant periods due to the lockdown. So to further support these businesses and aid their recovery, we're recommending 2 things. One is that there is no increase in the licence fees listed in the report for the year commencing the 1st of April 2021, save for the fees for pre-application advice, as this is not a statutory function. And we're also asking to extend the pro rata discount for businesses which have been required to close if the lockdown extends beyond the 19th of February 2021. For those special treatment premises which have received less than the 6.5-month pro rata discount to date, this would be applied to their 2021 renewal application, plus any further discount which is agreed today. For the gambling premises, we're proposing to apply the full pro rata discount for the period of closure since March 2020 to this year's annual fee. For completeness, within the table, I've included an alternative fee, which has been calculated based on the expected cost for that particular licensing function, should members decide that the fees should be increased. I would just like to add that details of the projected loss of income for this financial year, which is in the region of around 120k, has been sent to our finance team, and it is expected that some, if not all, of that money will be recoverable from central government via the coronavirus funding made available to local authorities. I'll leave it there and just if you've got any questions.
Thank you very much, Sharon. That was very thorough. Thank you. Any questions? I see Malcolm has your hand up. Think you're on mute, Malcolm? Or is that an old hand?
No, I'm here. Sorry. It's just a small trivial point on page 7. Table 3, sex establishments. The Part A and Part B total is not correct. It's only £1 difference. It should be 5583. I just worry if we're publishing it should be accurate. And the same for renewals. It should be 1575. I think it's just a typo. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. Judith, you have a question?
Yes, mine is also very trivial, and I know we haven't issued any licenses for them, but I wonder what Family Entertainment Centre on page 4 was.
This would be the type of arcade that you would normally find at the seaside, basically, the sort of penny slots kind of thing. We don't have any in the borough.
Okay,
so
great, that's what I thought. Thanks.
Yeah.
And Councillor Charles Williams, I know you had a question about.
Well, it was yes. So yes, it was more a sort of comment and a suggestion, which I'd raised with you in advance. I mean, in terms of the increase in fees, I think because of the problems that Ms. Dyball has explained, I would favour freezing the fees for special treatment licences. And as I think long-standing members of the committee know, most of these licences, we never ever actually issue any of them. But the gambling licences, I mean, I think my own view is that although I can see the merit for the pro rata reduction when they're forced to close, I think they should be increased. I think that as a council we shouldn't be seen to be encouraging gambling. So I think we should have the normal increase for the fees for the gambling type licenses.
Thank you, Charles. Any comments from other members about that in particular? Because this is the point we have to actually decide on. I personally have a view on it. I was initially in agreement about that because I agree you don't want to be pro-gambling, but then so much gambling now is being moved online. And I worry that as these places have been shut, I'm now worried that more and more gambling is just happening at home and in a much less regulated environment. And to increase this rather than a pro rata basis, I would be nervous of, but that's my opinion. Dory, your hand's up. Is this about the fees?
Yes, although not specifically on the sort of this ethical or moral question, but is about the fees. I've got several. If I'm a pass, I'll just put them together, 2 or 3 of them. First of all, can we afford no increase? Well, I mean, I understand the reasoning, but can we afford it? And relate to that, he says proposed recommended increases between 2 and 3. So if it's 2%, why do we have 3? And then if you look at new large casino, the suggested alternative fee is 1.8, 1.9, 1.9. Why not all the same? And if you look at the variation and transfer reinstatement, one of them goes up. The suggested alternative is 1.7%, and the other one 3.1%. So
yeah, good points. I'll bring Sharon in on those. I mean, as you know, we don't have any of those in our borough, but I'll bring Sharon in on that.
Yeah, for a lot of the fees, particularly the gambling fees, it would require a change to national legislation in order for us to have a new casino within the borough. They are limited by the Gambling Act. So it is largely a paper exercise. As far as the discrepancy between the increases, these are based on the actual costs for the officer who is doing the work, and our costs do vary year on year, and some of our hourly rates for different officers have increased, and in some cases they've actually decreased. And so we do have detailed spreadsheets which effectively calculate the fees for us based on the expected time for the particular part of the activity and who is doing that particular activity. And we have had some movement in the past 12 months as to the range of officer who is doing a particular part of the job. And so that is why there is a discrepancy between some of the increases. Some are lower than others. It's because the work that is being done may be being done by a different level of officer than previously, and so the fees would reflect that.
Understood. Thank you, Sharon. And the point about recouping overall costs, I think you covered that when you said you might be able to get the 120k from government funds. Is that? Yes. I mean, we're providing details to our finance department of loss to date. We did a big exercise on that at the end of January, and we factored into that some of the pro rata discounts that would need to be carried over into 2021-22 financial year. I'm not sure of what the mechanism is for actually recouping that money from the government. There is a fund, and the finance department are putting together the details of that, and it encompasses not just what we've lost on licence fees, but the additional costs to the department for visits and other work specifically related to coronavirus. So I'm hopeful that most, if not all, of our loss to date will be recoverable through that scheme. Okay, thank you.
That's
Julie,
the past. Sorry, that's the past. What about the future? My question was, can we afford no increase?
I think, the generally speaking, in previous years where we have increased the fees, it's generally been around the 2% mark. And it's led to an increase in expected income in the region of £8,000 to £9,000. So it's not a considerable sum of money in the overall budget for licensing income. Whether or not we can afford to lose that projected income is, I guess, is really a matter for the council, for the finance department. I think certainly with our special treatment fees in particular, those businesses are suffering immensely, and simply they are struggling to pay the fees even though we've discounted them. I think any increase could well, however small, could well put some of those businesses out of business.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. Julie, question.
I'm going to abstain on this because I don't think the papers are full enough, especially in terms of officer fees, one. And two, I don't actually understand why the licensing committee, which is meant to be a hearing committee, is actually opining on what are budgetary matters. So can you help me with that? But in any case, can you note my abstention in this vote?
Yes, noted. I suppose the fees, they've always been done this way. I mean, I noticed, I think actually you mentioned in 2016 sitting on something when the government changed, I think after the Hemmings Westminster Act, talked about looking at things. But maybe let's bring Heidi in here because that's, lots of hands have come up to this. Heidi, do you want to comment on this?
Yes.
Your abstention is noted. Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, yes, certainly. The reason why members have to approve this is because it's in the Constitution. And the Hemmings case, which was a Westminster case, one of the reasons Westminster fell foul of that case was because they didn't approve licensing fees year on year for a number of years. So it's vitally important that fees are properly authorised in order that they can be reclaimed. And that's the reason why this council has decided that licensing fees of this nature is given to the licensing committee. So that's why it comes before you.
Thank you. That's very clear. Charles Williams.
Just add that many of these used to be determined annually by the Regulation and Enforcement Committee. Councillor Doreen Weatherhead chaired that for many years. But when that was abolished or subsumed into this committee, obviously it had to come to this committee.
That's correct, Charles. That's my recollection. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for clarifying that. That was very useful. I have one question, if I may, Sharon, about page 8, the pre-application advice. And I think it's fantastic that you offer this. And just wondering, I think it seems incredibly good value. And just wondering, how does this compare with the planning pre-app fees? Or indeed with fees in other councils? I'm just trying to get some kind of benchmarking here.
In terms of planning, I think our fees are substantially less, I think, probably than the planning pre-application advice. I think the reason for that is that this is based on the amount of time that officers would expect to spend dealing with an application for pre-app advice. It's there to give applicants an indication of things that they should be looking to include within their application rather than an indication of how an application is likely to be viewed by committee. And it is based really on cost recovery. It's not really designed to make a profit. It is designed to cover our costs. And because it's not a statutory fee, we're therefore recommending that is actually increased in line with inflation, because applicants can choose whether or not to go down the pre-application advice and to use that service. We don't get a huge amount of applications in. Generally speaking, sort of 20 to 30 per year. It's not a big money maker for the department, but it does help to recover some of those costs which we're not legally or obliged to provide.
Yes, understood. Thank you. I mean, maybe just something just to look at, just to see if we could get to a side-by-side table of a couple of other boroughs, or if they do this, or planning. Just
yeah, we're happy to gather some data.
That's not an urgent request. Just a bit more data.
We can gather that and forward that round to the members.
Just to see. Thank you. I'm just going to see if there's anyone else who on the committee have not heard from. Joy, I know your hand's up, but there's quite a few people who've not heard from. If anyone wants to comment, I know MT was just saying something about this. Anything about the fees, MT? Or Janet, you've got your hand up.
I think perhaps, you know, at this time, maybe we should, you know, keep them where they are because, you know, our businesses have suffered. I take the point about the gambling. I mean, I don't think we should encourage it, but on the other hand, it is going online. So there we are. I think probably we should actually freeze the fees for now. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for that. Greg. Sorry, Janet. Let's go to Janet first. Your hand's up, Janet. Sorry.
Yes, I agree with that. First of all, we have on one street, Old Brompton Road, we have lost 2 betting premises out of 3, which shows that people are doing it online. It's actually more difficult to go to a gambling shop. I think if we lose all of our gambling premises, it loses some character as well. The granny who wants to put a bet on the Grand National, things like that. She's not going to go gambling online. So I think it would be terrible to raise fees right now. The businesses are really hurting, and this is an extensive lockdown. We don't even know yet what will happen, and we just cannot start doing that. It'll be impossible to get our respect back as a council, I think.
Thank you, Janet. That's very helpful. Greg, your hand's up.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, I took the point that Charles made, and also the point that Janet's just made in counter to it. I'd go with the flow of what's recommended for today. But if we were going to go down the route of thinking about it, I think we ought to have a considered debate rather than doing it on the spur of the moment in this meeting today. I think we ought to consider it in rather more detail if we're going to have a debate on principle, and therefore I would propose that we go with the flow of what's recommended to us for the purposes of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good point about more information and a considered debate. Thank you. Arian, nice to see your hand up. Hello.
Yeah, thank you, Soph. Just echoing what Janet and MT just said, I think just to keep the respect, and even if we increase the fee, I mean, that's not a considerable amount of profit, or you would say management costs. So I would say just to help the businesses, just not to freeze it. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've heard from lots of people. I don't know if Pat or Judith or Portia or anyone, I'm just going through anyone else on the call any other members who wants to say anything. Adrian? Judith, your hand's up.
Well, I'm a bit confused now as to whether we're voting for a freeze or the recommendation.
Well, I will put that to the vote. I think a few different, we've got one abstention already, and I'll go through it when we get to it. I just wanted to kind of allow everyone to kind of air their thoughts before we got to the actual vote. So do you have any thoughts specifically about the fees? Judith?
Not really, no. I mean, I don't like gambling, but that's a personal thing.
Okay. Adrian?
I think really 2 points. Firstly, just generally, I think Greg's got it right. I think this isn't something really to deal with on the fly. It needs proper debate if we're going to take a stance on it. And second, I mean, drinking, gambling, smoking, these are all things we disapprove of, but they are legal. And I think if we're going to charge a fee in order to enable them, in the absence of any decent arguments to the contrary, we just stay where we are.
Thank you for that. Very good points. Janet and Dory, those old hands up or new hands?
New hand in my case.
Dory, go for it.
I just want to ask about in the report, in the review background, paragraph 1.2, the current framework for what we're doing is an EC directive, European Commission directive. How will we be affected? Are we affected by Brexit? Presumably the existing law has been just incorporated into English law, but where are we with this and who's going to take care of it later on?
probably a question for Heidi, I suppose.
That's a good question. I haven't had a Brexit question. But my understanding is that the law changes until it is actually changed. So unless Parliament changes this would still apply. And also, Hemmings is, of course, an English case law that has been through the Supreme Court. So that does apply. Basically, it says that you can't charge a profit. You can recover your actual cost, but not your but not make it.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think, Adrian, is that an old hand that's up? Anything else?
I thought it had come down. I'm very sorry.
No problem at all. Just want to make sure everyone's had a chance to say about this, because we are making a decision on it. So I think we'll go to the decision now, A6. So the report, I'll just read out what the report says so we can all be clear what we're voting on. This report proposes changes to the fees charged by the licensing authority for applications, notifications, annual fees for various licenses from the 1st of April 2021. And the recommendations, just turn to the correct page. The recommendations which we're asked to approve is on page 9 of A6, at 6.1. The committee is asked to approve the proposed fees set out in tables 1 to 4 for the period commencing the 1st, to agree to reduce the gambling and annual fees by pro rata amount to take into account the period of closures from April 2020 due to the coronavirus pandemic. And the second, and point 3, to agree to an additional pro rata reduction of fees for special treatment and sex shop licenses who have suffered further lockdown restrictions since their 2020 fees were calculated. Those are the officer's recommendations. I am minded to agree to those recommendations. I noted we still have Councillor Mills's abstention. If anyone else would like to not agree to these or abstain, please let me know.
Or vote against, of course.
That's what I said, or not agree to them.
Agreed.
So we have no voting against.
Agreed.
And 1 abstention.
Agreed.
I agree.
Agreed.
Agreed. Thank you all very much. So that is decided on. Thank you. So we have the A7 report, which is for information. So we'll take all this as read, but please, if someone, I think will that be you again, Sharon, who's going to just talk to this report briefly?
Yes, it's me again, I'm afraid. Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, quite a few hands are up. Are those hands related to the last vote before we move on to A7? Pat, is that a new hand relating to the vote?
It's a new hand. I want to ask a question on A7.
Okay, fantastic. And Julie, is that a new hand relating to the vote or on A7?
Yes, please. I would like to ask a couple of questions, if I may.
About the vote? Or on
about
A7?
About the paper we're on now, which is A7.
Perfect. Fantastic. Brilliant. We'll just get Sharon to do a brief introduction, then bring you both in.
Thank you. Yes, this report basically sets out, it's an informative on some of the work undertaken by the licensing team over the past 12 months. And the summary further down on page 1 basically sets out the number of applications, hearing and enforcement activities in the past 12 months. Table 1 gives you a better indication of the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on our licensed businesses in terms of how it's affected applications. And I've included the figures there for 2019 as a comparison. Other than a small increase in the number of transfer and variation applications, we are down, as you can see, on every type of application across the board. The biggest loss is obviously in our temporary event notices, and that's just indicative of the fact that there've been no festivals, there've been no wedding parties, birthday parties, all of these things that normally we would have expected temporary event notices to have been submitted to extend hours. None of those have materialised. We also obviously lost over 100 temporary event notices for the Carnival weekend. And obviously during the lead up to Christmas, we would have expected a few hundred applications in for businesses wanting to extend over the Christmas period. Obviously, due to the lockdown and the other restrictions that were placed on the hospitality industry, none of those temporary event notices materialised. So we are 65% down on our temporary event notices. With special treatments, we've also seen a reduction in renewal applications, which is a bit of a concern. We're currently dealing with, we've just finished, or we should have finished receiving our last renewal period for this current year, financial year, for January. And to date, 15 applications of the 50 that we were expecting have not yet materialised. So we are trying to get hold of them. It could be that in some cases, you know, they've not received the application forms. We are having obviously difficulty contacting people because of the lockdown, but equally it could be that these businesses have already closed, and we just haven't found out yet. If you can just scroll the report down a little bit further, whoever's, I think it's probably Anne. So yes, I mean, we can see the impact just by the number of applications that the coronavirus is having on our licensed businesses. Another area where we've had a bit of an issue is in licensing fees. Normally, our licensed businesses, if they don't pay their license fees, we issue suspension notices shortly after the fees were due. In this case, we've suspended all suspension notices. We've issued no suspension notices at all since March last year, as it's had a bit of a devastating effect on our debt management. Ordinarily, we would have expected perhaps 20 or 30 of our businesses to have not paid at this stage in the year. Currently, as of this morning, we still have 254 overdue annual licence fees. We are contacting businesses and working with them to try and effect payment, but we have not reinstated the suspensions. It's not the right time at the moment. Businesses are closed. Although some businesses are still managing to offer a takeaway service, for the majority of our premises, they're not even managing to do that. So that's one area where we do need to do quite a bit of work going forward to try and recover those fees. The other thing as well is we don't yet know how many of those businesses have actually closed and will not be reopening. So looking forward, that's what we'll be concentrating on. Special treatment premises, I've already mentioned. Mm-hmm. We've had, the coronavirus has impacted them substantially, and they've been required to close completely for 6 or 7 months of the year. We are still working our way through the renewals for those. At the moment, we still have 85 premises that are still to pay their licence fees. We are working with them. We are giving them some time to pay, so we're extending their payment terms. But again, our efforts are being hampered by the fact that we are still in this national lockdown. In terms of our inspections, again, our planned inspections were halted at the end of March last year, and our officers have been dealing primarily since April, almost exclusively actually since April, on coronavirus, on dealing with complaints, on providing support to businesses as they try and navigate the various changes to the coronavirus which have come into effect. That has been a major difficulty for us, as well as our licensed businesses, just basically getting our head around the changes. We've had numerous regulations come out with no notice at all. The government announces on the TV changes that are coming into effect, and then we're all scrambling around trying to get the regulations and actually look at the detail, because as they say, the devil is in the detail, and what's announced on TV is just a fraction of what we need to try and understand, and we have to understand it in order to help our businesses. So the enforcement officers in particular have had their work cut out on that score, dealing with that and basically trying to deal with the breaches that have occurred. And obviously businesses have basically tried to do as much as they can to try and get round some of the restrictions that have been placed on them. During the summer months, you'll be aware that we had a problem up in Portobello in particular. A few of the premises started doing off sales. That then turned into unlicensed music events, and there were street parties every night with hundreds of people. This was at a time when we were still in a national lockdown. So the officers have worked tirelessly with licensees to try and basically gain compliance, not just with the not just with the theme of the regulations, but actually with the letter of the law, basically. We've done mail outs to premises just before the lockdown was lifted. Our enforcement officers were out and about with the police. They visited several hundred licensed premises in the space of 2 days, literally just going round on foot round the borough, speaking to licensees and trying to basically help them, to advise them on what they needed to do to make sure they complied with the coronavirus restrictions, things like mask wearing, no more than 6 people, how they could utilise the provisions of the Business and Planning Act as regards off sales and what that allowed them to do. Obviously with this current lockdown, we're currently, the enforcement officers in particular are working actually on the debt recovery side. Normally that would have been done by the administrators, but we've got a backlog of applications still to deal with, backlog of licenses to issue. So the work has been redistributed. The debt recovery work has been redistributed at the moment to the enforcement officers. Other than that, I've listed there some of the other substantive work that the team has undertaken in the last 12 months. The review of the statement of licensing policy. We have weekly returns that we have to provide to the government on coronavirus related work. The Notting Hill Carnival, even though last year's carnival didn't go ahead, the meetings were still continuing up until I think it was about June. And since then, there are still weekly meetings ongoing as they plan for this year's carnival. I think it's highly likely that carnival will not go ahead, but at this stage, things are still ongoing as if the carnival would be going ahead. So there's a lot of work that officers are involved with as regards planning for this year's carnival. And basically any other large scale events, obviously the Chelsea Flower Show, our officers are dealing with the organisers there. That has been deferred until September at the earliest. At the moment, we don't know whether or not it will still go on in September, but work has to continue in the planning stages for these events in the event that they do go ahead, albeit it might be on a smaller scale. I think I'll leave it for there, and I'm sure there's questions that people will want to ask.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Just before we get to the questions, just want to reiterate what I said at the very beginning of this meeting, to thank you and all your team for this lot of work this year, and just the list and point 4 you say of all the extra work and everything, and it's a a huge amount on your plate. So thank you very much. So Pat, you had a question about this paper.
Yes. Sorry, I was just checking whether I was muted or not. I think the report is excellent, and Sharon's statement has covered quite a lot of what I wanted to ask questions about. I'm mainly concerned about the number of unpaid licence fees. And Sharon said that officers are, in fact, contacting licensees to try and find out why they haven't paid. I'd like to know whether there has been any clear explanation as to why they're getting behind. And more trivially, under licence suspensions, paragraph 2.7, I think there's a mistake in the last sentence, which says that licensees are now sent an invoice for their annual fee 1 month before the due date, with reminders sent 21 and 31 days after the initial invoice. Well, if you're sending it 1 month before the due date, you can't send a reminder at 31 days, can you?
Thank you, Pat. Shall we just see? So, can we just hold that question about what you're doing about collecting the fees and everything, and just see that if similar questions come up, Sharon?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thanks, Pat. Julie, your hands up.
Thank you. I'm echoing Sof's and other committee members, empathise with enforcement officers and with the department, and always thank you for really excellent work. I suppose in the same way, I no doubt enforcement officers will be looking at whether it's installments or conditions. I don't quite, this is new territory for the department. So how will you be dealing with how to deal with businesses that are struggling, that may close down, and whether, a bit like the rates, we can look at imaginative ways of helping them to pay. My other question, which was occurred to me through all of this, is, of course, as older members of the committee will remember the lawyers saying to us, to the authority, that it was death by condition. And as an authority, we have put a lot of conditions onto our licenses. I just wondered if that was having an impact. I noticed that the training and the incident logs are not actually being adopted. That could be a cost issue. And may I suggest to the chairman and to officers that we might want to do some work. Hate to give you more work, but do we need to actually look at these conditions now, so that we're not doing death by COVID and death by condition, and see if we can't get a little more kind of leeway into how we actually now impose conditions and enforce conditions on the license. I don't believe that if we're going to entertain, we should, if licenses are going to, if conditions are going to be breached, then I think we should enforce. So maybe we need to look at the conditions if in fact the inclination going forward may be that we're going to not enforce. And my last question, actually, Chairman, if I may, just to put it out now, so that when it comes up, it's in the right paper, it's the right place, is how are the virtual, if it is that the hospitality industry, as the ministers are saying, is not going to recover for some 2 to 3 years, social isolation is going to remain. Many of these committee meetings are still going to be virtual. How is the virtual part of the application, both to officers, but also to committee hearings, evolving? How can it be improved? And we will be looking at that. And thank you for your indulgence in listening, Chairman, but those are my 2 questions.
Thank you, Julie. Those were actually very, very interesting. And I do think it's something that we should be looking at as a committee, definitely, about the conditions. I know Heidi will say every license is unique and individual and taken on its own merits. But I think in general, I about the conditions, and seeing, as Sharon says, that that is one of the enforcement issues. Maybe Sharon, you can come back to us about whether we could look at that as part of a kind of a work stream with officers. And again, virtual improvements, maybe that's something we can look at, we can discuss with, I know governance have been, Anne and Gareth in particular have been involved massively with planning and licensing, which are 2 of the big kind of public facing committees. So I think it would be really good actually to do a bit of review and a bit of work on that, because as you say, that they could all be with us for a long time. So before I bring in, I think maybe Heidi can add to those. But before I bring in Heidi and Sharon, can we just hear what Dory has to say as well, please? And then Adrian. Dory, or is that an old hand? How many times have I said that today? Dory? No?
I think Dory's talking, his lips are moving, but he's on mute, so none of us are getting the benefit of what he's got to say.
Oh, thank you, Greg. Yes, it's the old story. We can sing a song about unmuting. In paragraph 3.5, talking about the inspections, it says more than one. So when we come to table 3, could we, how many of these, you see, you've listed the number of instances, but it doesn't say how many premises are involved. So maybe a table showing, or an amendment to the table showing how many premises have more than one breach will be handy. So that's really one question. Actually, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for this time. I'll ask another one later.
Point. Yeah, repeat offenders rather than new novices. Yeah. Adrian.
Yeah.
Adrian. Do you have a question, Adrian, or again?
No, I don't think I have my hand up, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Okay, so Sharon, can we turn to you first about Pat's question about non-payment and collecting, and because I mean it's such a small amount per premises, from £75 to £1,000, if I'm correct, that they must be in serious difficulty if they're not paying that, or maybe it's just another administration burden. Could you maybe enlighten us a bit more on that aspect?
Yeah, so I think one of the points that Councillor Healy made was around the reminders and the final demand. Under the Licensing Act, the fee has to be paid before the due date. Otherwise, the council is required to suspend the licence. That is the law. So we have set up an automatic interface with our finance system. So the invoices are generated 1 month in advance, and that does give people ample opportunity, normally under normal circumstances, to pay by the actual due date, which is 31 days later. With the reminders, these are generated automatically via our finance system, and again they do come out 21 days after the invoice date, which strictly speaking is still before the due date, but it just basically reminds them that the fee hasn't been paid. But as soon as we get to the actual due date, which would be 31 days after the initial invoice date, at that point, if it's not paid, it is overdue, and their licenses are liable to be suspended. So that's in terms of the cycle of the reminders. In terms of why people haven't paid, I wonder if I could pass over to perhaps Laura and Fiona, who are on the meeting, because they have been speaking to our licensees, and so they may be able to give an indication as to why payment has been delayed in these cases. So perhaps Laura or Fiona could chip in.
Yes, can I just, thanks Laura and Fiona, before we just chip in, can I just ask what the clarification for item 2.8, because suspension notice was temporarily halted on the 20th of March. When did that, when was that stopped again or started again? Or, I mean, because we talk a lot about pro rata in the previous fees, but we don't really seem to be talking about pro rata in these fees.
Right, so under the Licensing Act, the fees are set by statute, so we have no power to discount the fees. This is something that has been raised with the Home Office. A number of local authorities, ourselves included, have asked the question, is there a way that a change can be brought in so that we could consider whether or not to discount the fees? Excuse me. And the answer that we've got back from government is that no, the fees are set in statute and there are no proposed changes to those fees to take account of the coronavirus restrictions. So that's the reason why the fees haven't been discounted. As far as the suspensions are concerned, obviously when premises are already closed and unable to operate, it is quite harsh to then, we felt it was quite harsh to then send them a notice and say, well, you've not paid and therefore we're suspending it. Particularly as we know how businesses are struggling. So what we've done for the moment is we've delayed issuing suspension notices. We can't halt it altogether because we are legally required to suspend licenses if they don't pay. At the moment, obviously being in the current lockdown, we will wait until that is lifted, and then we will probably concentrate our efforts on finding which of those premises who haven't paid are still operating, and work with them to get payment first. But we do have a lot of licenses, 250 licenses at the moment, so that's a lot of premises for us to get round.
Thank you for clarifying. Sorry, Laura, Fiona, do come in. Thank you.
Hi there. So we have actually, in the enforcement team, we've contacted over 40 operators in the past fortnight, and the majority of those have been really surprised that their fee was due. I think invoices have been going to premises or to head office, where they haven't actually had any people on site. So they have been quite surprised, and they seem to so far be amenable to paying straight away. We've had a few operators that have actually paid business rates in error earlier on the year, last year, and then business rates have been refunded. So it's just administration, really, I think. So yeah, I don't think so far we haven't come across any obstacles with operators.
And obviously, licensed premises like supermarkets, which are still open, there's no problem with any of them, is there?
No, and also late night refreshment premises, all our takeaways are the first people we are contacting because obviously they've operated throughout and probably done quite well. So they've been our first port of call.
Okay, just bringing Pat back in here. Do you want to follow up?
Sorry, just on muting. No, that's helpful. I think that the way that the notices, the invoice and the subsequent notices is expressed in 2.7 is slightly misleading. I understand what Sharon said, but it's not quite what it says in the paragraph. So perhaps next year it will be changed so that it's clearer. Otherwise, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. And can I bring Heidi in here, please, just to comment on what Julie said about the conditions on licenses and just looping it back into if those are some of the breach of conditions on the enforcement issues.
Yes, certainly, Chair. I mean, at this time, I mean, the last year has been a struggle for a lot of the hospitality industry. So I can understand why these concerns have been raised. In terms of Licensing Act applications, of course, once a license is granted, it's granted forever, and it's subject to the conditions that are on the license. So the operator has to comply with those conditions, and the committee can't simply, or the officers can't simply decide which conditions they don't have to comply with. They can make an application for a modification, a minor variation, perhaps to modify some of the conditions, but that might be inadvisable because once the premises get going, they'll then need to comply with those conditions. But as always, a licensing authority does have the discretion to decide whether it's appropriate to take any action in relation to conditions. So they always must take a measured approach. So if premises are not operating, as Sharon has advised, they take a pragmatic approach with these things. It's like the suspension fees as to whether to suspend or not. The Minister, Kit Malthouse, issued a letter asking all licensing authorities to take pragmatic approaches because he knew that, in fact, if you wanted to amend these things, you'd need primary legislation, and that takes 3 or 4 months to go through the Houses of Parliament. And what with the government, with all the other legislation they're dealing with, obviously it's not appropriate for that to be on the agenda. So I mean, the licensing authority always has the discretion, and they do, as has been shown, dealing with the suspensions. They are trying to help operators and deal with it pragmatically. I don't know whether that answers your question.
That does. It was Julie's point. I think that's very interesting. Maybe we'll bring Julie back here in a minute. I think, Dory, hang on 1 minute. But I suppose from sitting on many committees, I often see lots more new conditions being put on the license, which I think was Julie's point. And as often they're obviously advised by officers, and then we as committee members approve or not approve them. And maybe that's something, maybe we are putting on too many not relevant or not proportionate or not appropriate conditions. I think maybe the question, and maybe that's something we could look at.
Yeah, that's certainly a good point. And I mean, you as a committee, in each subcommittee, you must decide on each case whether it's appropriate and proportionate to attach a condition. The only thing I would say is that traditionally it is the case, and this is found in this authority and other authorities, that people who apply for license will often put minimal conditions in their operating schedule, because they're waiting to see whether representations are made, and then they add them at that stage. So it's not an ideal process, but it's always operated that way. That at the committee, the major amount of the conditions are added at that time. It would be much easier for lawyers if the applicants suggested the conditions when they put the applications in. They don't always do that, but you should only ever attach conditions if they are proportionate in the given circumstances of the case.
Yes, thank you for that. Julie, do you want to come back in on this?
Yes, I mean, thank you for that, Heidi. I think the point is that we're moving into new territory, and you're right, Soph. It's about the fact that when we decided to adopt Westminster's model conditions, which I think ran, and remember at the time certainly were many, it's just become normal practice to just take it and sort of arbitrarily put it onto the license without necessarily thinking if they were either proportionate or really applicable to today's kind of business function. May I recommend something to you? In now that the authority is actually reaching out to its community, is it time to ask the licensing community what conditions they think would be effective? Because I often think this has come top down from Westminster and not actually come in from the licensing community itself. And I just wonder if they might have a lot more imaginative conditions that would be good for their business and good for the look of the high street. So apart from the kind of what I would call municipal conditions, can we hear perhaps from the community as to what would be good things and what they don't like and what they do like and what's effective for their business going forward? So that would be my only closing comment. Thank you, Heidi, for the answer.
Yeah, can I just add to that? Just to clarify, Kensington never adopted the Westminster model conditions. I mean, both Westminster and Kensington, we do work together, but we don't adopt the Westminster conditions, which have not been changed in years. Whereas, in fact, Mr. Crowley and I think Laura McGahn, they did review the conditions over a year ago because our conditions were updated. But it's always a good idea to review conditions. So certainly we can look at that. But they should be tailored to the individual character and style of the premises in question. Often they are similar, and in fact, my understanding is one of the complaints under the old regime before the Magistrates' Court was that there was no consistency in conditions, whereas now operators tend to they like to know what type of conditions they should be offering for each authority. So on the one hand, they do like the fact that we do have a bank of conditions that they can look at. So that is helpful, but certainly I'm not sure how we would ask operators what sort of conditions they would want, because if I was acting for an operator, I would suggest very few conditions, because it's better to have less conditions, whereas from a resident's point of view, it might be better to have more conditions. So there's a difficulty there as to what conditions you put on.
Okay, and understand that. Maybe that's something, I know I don't again add to officers' workload, but that's something over the course of this year. I think it would be good to ask to be in touch more with the licensing community. I know Pat was regularly in touch, and I'm sure Sharon is as well. But somehow to do some kind of review along those lines. So let's park that for now, but let's put that on some action plan, if we may, as a committee, would be fantastic. Thank you. Dory, is your hands up? Is it still old hand?
New hand. I put only my first question sort of set. Now I've got a second one.
Go on then.
It's to do with comparisons. First of all, the numbers. For example, could we show more than just last year, the previous year, but say 4 or 5 years on some of these things? For example, table 1, see a trend. Table 2, not all of it, percentage and pending, but maybe some of that to show a 4 or 5 year trend rather than just from 1 year to the next. And on that comparison, on paragraph 3.5, to see how many breaches there are. So 62 were, okay, this period is 3 months, but whatever it is, that we look at the last, say, 4 years or 5 years as to how this is running as a percentage of the total premises or premises inspected. And in the comparison question also, how does this, here's my question. Oh, here you are, paragraph 216, in terms of outstanding payments and so on. How is the situation compared to Westminster? Are they in a worse state? Obviously, as a percentage, because they have a lot more, but as a percentage, do you think, how would we compare? Obviously, the tables you can't produce now, but I'm just suggesting for next time that we have.
Okay, thanks, Doris. So noted for next time, if that was possible, Sharon, in a few more years, would be great. I think we won't compare that last bit with Westminster, because that's a whole extra body of work. We're only using that because we have Heidi with us now to compare.
I'm just curious to know if someone can say, Heidi can say on top of her head or something like that.
Heidi, up to you.
Sorry, unfortunately, I don't have that. I don't have that information on Westminster in terms of their debts and suspensions.
I think we can assume that across the UK, licences are being chased and businesses are struggling, I would have thought. I think we're reaching the end of this paper. Thank you very much. I just got one final comment on 3.10, and maybe just to kind of add that, because I do know that lots of those the instances around Portobello Road, in fact, I ended up getting caught up in one of them. And I know there were very many, and I spoke to Monica about various things about these as well. But it wasn't necessary. I think the paragraph certainly implies it was due to licensed premises. Some of them were nothing. They were just gatherings of people bored on the street, having a party on the street. So I wouldn't want to. I know some licensed premises were anyway, but that's just.
I think certainly at the beginning, when it all started, I think it was being exacerbated by the fact that the pubs were selling off sales, but
and the supermarkets and people
exactly, and
it wasn't necessarily the licensed areas, say, for example, outside premises. Exactly.
Yeah. It wasn't there. It wasn't down to the licensees. It wasn't something that they could have controlled. But I think it was just being exacerbated by the fact of those premises in the area.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this report. That's hugely informative, and I think some really interesting discussions came up, which I think we're going to go away with. And again, about the virtual thing, I haven't brought Anne and Gareth into this, but maybe if we can just mark that as an action point to do a review on how the virtual committee has gone and what could be done better and what has gone well. So thank you everyone for that. So we now have Heidi's paper.
Hello, thank you, Chair. So this is the appeals report for the last year since February 2020. I'm pleased to report that we've only had one new appeal, which is the UK AI application, which was a review that Councillor McVeigh sat on with another two members. So in terms of this report, it's basically saying of the appeals that we've had, 5 were withdrawn, and as you know, the 2 subterranean, which was on the previous report, were determined, but we have been trying to get some costs out of those. I don't have an update on how much more we've received because, of course, during the lockdown, any litigation action has been really suspended to a large degree. So I would have to update members on that. In terms of Juju, that was withdrawn. Ping, we did obtain some funds. I believe we got £4,500 back in costs. The Elements special treatment and the Moonflower special treatment, these were 2 appeals that we managed to deal with last year, whereby both of them were withdrawn because the operators transferred the license to different companies. I'm pleased to report that in both of those cases, I did negotiate a fee with them and the sums have been fully paid for both special treatments, which is good, bearing in mind that special treatments have not been able to open a lot during the lockdown. And then the last one, which was the UK AI Portobello Road, which was a review brought by a resident and supported by a number of residents. There were also residents who were supportive of the premises. This was heard last year, and the operators had legal advisors and a barrister at the hearing, and they agreed most of the conditions. So I was quite surprised when they actually did put in an appeal on this case. But I said that we regarded the appeal to be an abuse of the process of court, because in fact they were appealing against something they had agreed, and thankfully they accepted what I said and they withdrew the appeal. So I'm now going to try and get some costs out of them. So that's the extent of the appeals that we've had. So unless members have got any questions, that's all I think I need to say about the report at the moment.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and thank you for being so diligent and getting so many of the costs back as well. Yes, all very familiar to me, most of these cases. so that's great. Any questions, Dory?
Thank you. Well, actually, one question got answered. Subterranean, 2 cases still pursuing.
Yeah.
Hard to find. But how do you actually pursue it? I mean, do you issue a summons or something? I mean, how do you actually pursue it when it gets difficult?
Well, that's a good question, because you can't get blood out of a stone. So there's always a question as to how far you should pursue these, because you can end up spending, throwing good money after bad. So you always have to consider a case as to whether it is appropriate to pursue an application against them. You can. There's various means. It depends if it's an individual. You can always issue a claim in the civil courts, and you can also apply for bankruptcy or winding up. But in my experience, when we've applied for bankruptcy and winding up in the past, and we certainly have done that on other appeals, you don't actually get any money. So that's why you'd have to think carefully about going down those lines. And at the moment, because of the lockdown, premises are suffering. So that's an added factor because people just don't have the money.
Sure, thanks. My other question is, it's for a case which is actually not in this report, but I thought this might be the most appropriate moment, this paper, because I thought there might have been an appeal, and that's our old friend Ariadne's in Latimer Road. Where are we with that? Was he closed?
Well, no, there hasn't been an appeal, and the main reason for that is probably my fault, is because I haven't got the full decision out yet on that one. We've done a number of reviews this year, and we're working our way through the reviews. So once I get the decision out on that, then they'll have 21 days to appeal, and there will be an appeal because I know they've instructed James Rankin. I'm pleased that they have instructed legal representation. So I fully expect that there will be an appeal because that was a revocation.
I know, I did it. I was there on it. That's why I was wondering what happened to it. And okay, thanks very much.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And I just wanted again, going back to one of Dora's comments about tables, Heidi, in a future report, is it possible to see just a kind of a final kind of cost thing at the end, just to see how much these appeals cost and versus how much we actually managed to get back? And I mean, I know you're incredibly rigorous about fighting them and getting our costs back. And in fact, I think as a committee, we have very few appeals because the decisions are so sound.
Yes, there's only, we'd have to think how we would do that. The reason for this is that when I recover costs from legal cases, we charge a commercial rate, whereas the internal rate is lower. So I wouldn't really want to reveal our internal rate. That's the only, I'm not quite sure, we might need to think about that.
Okay, understood. I'll leave that in your hands. That was just a thought. So okay. just see. And I see Malcolm, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Well, Heidi's there. Two issues have come up recently, and I wonder if this is an opportunity for a training session. There are particularly legal matters, so it gets tricky for us as lay members. Heidi is always very good at guiding us. One of them is where we stand with these appeals, and then the license holder then just sets up a new company and sort of uses that as an evasion of having the revocation or the review and just starts again. Do we have a policy on that, and how do we handle it? And secondly, the thing that you'll remember, Chair, this thing about the premises license holders saying that the designated premises supervisor was off on a frolic, which is a legal expression recognised in British law, and thereby they evade their responsibility, their vicarious liability. They say they're not legally responsible for what happened in the premises. And we had this tortuous process of trying to trace back culpability back to the premises license holder. And I wonder if we need some training on that, if there's a better way of doing it.
Yes, I mean, I'm quite happy to provide training and work with you for some training on repeals. In terms of revoking a license and then hey ho, an operator opens under a different name, that's perfectly legal, unfortunately. So that can be done. It's very difficult to, even if you had a policy, it wouldn't affect the situation because it's legally allowed under the Licensing Act. But in terms of the DPS, the premises license holder blaming it all on the DPS and making them to fall on their sword, yes, you're quite right. We've had a few cases where this is suggested. You'll be aware of the Casa Cruz application where that seemed to be indicated last week, but it didn't save the premises license holder. because action was taken against them, because of course it is the responsibility of the premises licence holder to ensure that the licence are the conditions are observed. But we can certainly think about some training. If you let me know exactly what you would like, we can do some training for you.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for those questions. Thank you. Julie? Yes?
Just on the last point, if I may interject, I'm not wanting to extend the meeting, but I mean, I think it has been quite, I'm not going to say amusing, but it has been quite informative over the years. I think Heidi and Sharon will mention when we did go on the trail of the final ownership of many of these establishments, and had to go all the way back to Grand Cayman in many cases, where obviously even through Companies House you can't track the actual ownership. If I may, I do recommend that members, when they are on committee, should look up Companies House. I think it's a very, very good discipline to see who the person is. But we did have a couple of quite successful times when we actually got people who you would know who are in the public light, who are behind these premises, being called in, hauled in before a very modest licensing committee, as we self-styled ourselves, to explain how they were treating their DPSs, how they were trading their what was in on their premises. And sometimes that threat of actually hauling in some bigwig known person in the public light will have the desired effect of actually bringing them to the table where they actually impose conditions. So do remember that you have powers where that sort of thing is concerned, in trying to haul in who the final owner is, to give evidence to the committee as how they propose to run their establishments properly. So it's just anecdotal, but I thought it might be illustrative.
Thank you. That's always good to bear that in mind. Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Heidi, for that report. That was very, very good. That was for information only, and so thank you so much. So no action needs taken on that, but that is,
thank you.
Thank you. And so now, any other business? Do please raise your hands for any other business. Julie, is that Julie or Dory?
Sorry. No, sorry.
No, your hand.
Yeah, old hand, sorry.
Sorry.
Yes, I don't know if Sharon, if you want to just mention it, it's just to put this thing on the table rather than discuss anything. Well, up to people, I suppose. Sharon, you know about hotels? Ms. Dyball, or shall I say a sentence or two?
So Dory, I believe you want to make sure hotels are included in the next statement of licensing policy.
Yes, it's just to say, or I'll say it then. I've passed it around to a few people, a proposal to put in a paragraph into the statement of licensing policy on hotels, because it's unclear, and I've discovered there's nothing anywhere in the country, not even in Westminster. So I'll put some proposals in, and anyone who's interested can see my paper, and I'll be in touch with licensing to get some proper wording in, and whenever the consultation comes up in a year or whenever, we can stick it in. Thank you.
Thank you, Dory. And can I just clarify from you, the Sharon or Heidi, because obviously we did our statement of licensing policy this year within the legal time frame we had to do it, and we did a very light touch approach because of the circumstances everyone was in. So it might well be that our statement of licensing policy might be looked at again sooner than the statutory amount. So that would be a good time to bring that in.
Yes, and I've already spoken to Councillor Schmetterling about this. We've put that on the list of things to be considered for the next review, and I think it's highly likely, given the current situation, that it will be sooner rather than later. So although the policy is for 5 years, I can certainly see us reviewing the policy at some point, probably within the next 12 to 18 months, I would imagine at the most.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you, George, for putting that up. And if that can please be minuted, that'd be very helpful. Any other business anybody wants to bring more attention to? No? Well, then I can bring this meeting to a close. Thank you all very much for attending, and good to see everybody. So thank you. The meeting is now closed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Bye.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you next year. This time next year.
Thank you. Bye.
I'm going to feed the cat.